Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Ramona Hattendorf. I am the Director of Public Policy and Civic Engagement at the Arc King County. Thank you so much for joining us today for Why Choose Inclusion, where we're going to look at accessibility and belonging in public schools. And just so you know, today is this is one of two parts. The second part will be tomorrow afternoon, and that one's going to go a little bit more into some of the laws that support inclusive education. But first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about why we are doing this series. It's part of a series of workshops we're doing for the Inclusionary Practices Technical Assistance Network. I think I got that right. They call themselves the IPTN. It's a statewide collaboration. It's led by our state office that oversees schools, which is the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. They work with a consultant called West Ed. And then there's education partners, dozens of education partners across the state. And one of those is an entity called the Family Engagement Collaborative, and we're part of that collaborative. Also in that collaboration is Education Northwest, Roots of Inclusion, and PAFE. So you might know some of these other groups. And we're doing several series. Just so you know, we have one that is really more around disability education. That seemed to be something that was missing from the resources that they had accumulated. If you don't know, if you just Google IPTN OSBI, there's many resources they've collected and developed over the last 5 or so years. So one is on understanding disability. Another series is aimed towards educators on just some insights on supporting families. And this one is about navigating schools. And everyone is welcome, but we try to gear this one a little bit more towards families and for people who support families to give them some information and understanding. These two classes are the accessibility and belonging. And we've added a third class under this heading, which I'll get into at the end. But that's going to be a class really on creating an inclusive IEP. And that will be in April 22. And then we also have some basic classes. We're doing a series in England, excuse me, a series in English and a series in Spanish. And it's a 3-course. One is like some 10 tips. Another one is going to look into, how do you manage conflict, classes like that. So those are our 3 basics, and those are upcoming a little bit later. All the classes in this series, people are welcome to join live, but we're also going to be recording them and posting, and anyone who registers will get a link, and they will be available through June. So hopefully we'll get a lot of people learning about inclusion in the community. So who we are, if you're not familiar with the ARC at King County, we promote and protect the rights of people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities, so we can all live, play, work in the community. We have a really fundamental belief that we want people to write their life story. And so that means really meaningful engagement and meaningful educational opportunities and meaningful employment. The basis of a lot of what we do is really about inclusion. It's beyond inclusive schools, it's inclusion in the community and participation and involvement. And there are many chapters across the United States. At our chapter, we just do King County. We offer information and family support, systems navigation, education, and civic engagement support. And we also run a supported living program for adults with intellectual or other developmental disabilities. On this slide, there's a link to our website if you're interested. If people need assistance, if you have questions, you want some support, Ask ARCA King County is a really good way to get a hold of us. And then my contact information is there as well. So I have this broken into 3 sections. Section 1 is how do you define inclusion? So on this one, I have 3 questions for you. What qualities do you associate with inclusion? What qualities do you associate with exclusion or segregation? And what images come to mind when you think of these terms? So if you could just take a couple minutes and just think, and if you feel for it, go ahead and put them in the chat. That would be great. So what do you associate with inclusion, and what do you associate with exclusion or segregation? And are there any images? One comment: inclusion is welcoming, accommodating, open minded, breaking down barriers, opening the circle. One quality feeling I think about is warmth. Yeah, sense of warmth. Yeah, exclusion, assuming how folks will be. So on this next slide, it's a question. This is a slide we use in a class called How Change Happens. And it just takes the steps to behavioral change, and we try to apply that to advocacy, because in the advocacy world, sometimes, you know, what you want to tell someone or what you want to ask somebody or materials that you want to create will really vary kind of depending on where they are in the spectrum. And it has 5 steps. Pre-contemplative is there's no problem. Why are people even talking about inclusive schools? The next step would be contemplation, where somebody recognizes a problem. Like, yeah, it does seem to be a lot of segregation, happening, but they're not really ready yet to make a change. Preparation is you want to make a change and you're planning for change. Action is the plan's done and you are implementing it. You are doing the change. And maintenance is monitoring or adjusting. So you've already got an inclusive placement, or your school has already moved into being more inclusive, and now you're just maintaining it. And I'm curious if the group here today would like to just sort of note in the chat where you are on this spectrum of inclusive education. Are you thinking about it? You don't even think it's a problem? Are you preparing for it? Are you in the middle of taking action about it? Or are you maintaining? And feel free to put it in the chat. Ah, one comment. It is all over the spectrum for us, depending on the team, on the resources, and the environment. Sounds like there's a lot of start and stop. And for those who joined recently, welcome. We're so glad you're here. I'll be sending out a recording of the meeting so you can catch up. Another comment, it fluctuates between preparation, action, and maintenance. Interesting. Same thing. It's not one clear step. It's several. Lots of levels of understanding, misunderstanding, and preparedness, and willingness to go outside the box. I imagine that is very individualized, depending on who you're working with. Yeah. So I'll move on, but this is just something to think about. Just kind of hold it in. Like, what does inclusion mean to you? What does exclusion or segregation mean to you? How do you hold those things? And then on this, you may or may not want to be on a journey. You may like things exactly the way they are. and you're just curious about why somebody else wants to be on the journey. But if you're on the journey, just thinking about where you are and maybe where some of the people are. Um, do you have to sell them on the concept? Do they need tools to implement? Do they need resources to implement? Sometimes it's just very helpful to figure out where to start. And unfortunately, it sounds like the lived experience in the room is that you're dealing with a lot of people who are at different places, and it can fluctuate. Yeah. All right. So that was just our contemplative start. And now we're going to do an overview. This is just going to ground us. So we have some similar terms and some similar understanding. And then we're going to go, after this section, we're going to go a little bit more into some of the research. So inclusive education, what it is, and what do we need to make sure all kids get one. So first of all, I'm going to be going into some basic concepts, and they are grounded in the laws, and they are also grounded in research. Today, we're going to go a little bit more into the research. Tomorrow, we'll go more into the laws, but a really fundamental truth is that public education needs to work for all students. This is a value many people hold, but it's also something that has basis in the law. It needs to work for all students, not just some students. It's supposed to work for everyone. And then special education services, not a place, services are there to ensure access to education. So it's not supposed to be a separate thing. It's supposed to be something that actually gives you access to the thing. And then inclusive education supports students who are learning together, anticipates diverse needs, accessible, responsive to students. And the point here is it's not just putting all the kids together and saying, oh, everyone's included. That's could be, you might think of that as integration or just everyone's in the same place. There's really something intentional about it, and it's really needs to be responsive to the student and where they are. This is a big term that's really important to just the whole concept of inclusion is presumed competence. And that's the assumption that everyone has the capacity to learn, think, and understand, regardless of diagnosis or disability. And then you've got basic rights. There's an equal opportunity to benefit. This is something that is in the Americans with Disability Act. You have an equal opportunity to participate. The Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 really embraced these concepts. Schools can't deny access to students with disabilities. They also can't require students with disabilities to be educated separately just because they have a disability. Individualized does not mean services need to be provided in segregated settings. That's a big myth a lot of people are working on, and it's one we battle all the time. I do a lot of work with legislative advocacy, and that was some of the testimony from legislators is that education, special education, we need to make sure we have separate classes because that's where the individualized education happens. It doesn't happen in the mainstream class, and it can happen in a separate class, but it actually does not have to happen in a second class. And that's one of the myths that the state actually, the OSBI, is trying to dispel is this idea that individualized education needs to happen separately. Does not. So IDEA, what is this? This is the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and that spells out all the rules for special education services. Ah, is that a question? We have a comment there, IDEA versus No Child Left Behind. IDEA is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that set up the program of special education and also set up the program for early supports for infants and toddlers. It set up these things of due process, the concept that families are a partner in this, just sort of the legal guidelines around it, and also that there will be funding from the federal government that gets processed and gets distributed. So it's called title program. It's actually a grant. The states have to apply for a grant. No Child Left Behind is also a federal program that's broader than disability, and that one was really centered, or is really centered in helping kids who might be disadvantaged in other ways as well. So like poverty, maybe language, maybe some rural, really mostly poverty though is where it's centered, and funding is distributed based on poverty levels in the schools. And No Child Left Behind started in the first one was I can't even remember what the initials were. But it was passed in 1965. No Child Left Behind is what it was called in, I think, the 1990, when one of the Bushes was in charge. And now it's been reauthorized, and now it's called ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act. And then we have Section 504, Rehabilitation Act in 1973. That's the one with equal access and opportunity. And this group of legislation, say the IDEA, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title II, those together make the legal framework for inclusion. And just if you're not aware, so the Americans with Disability Act is a civil rights legislation. It was passed in 1990. Title II of that says local and state government cannot discriminate on the basis of disability. And that's where they really have this. There needs to be equal access, and there needs to be an equal opportunity to benefit. So this is bigger than school districts. It includes school districts because they are a local type of local government, and that involves public programs and practices. But this encompasses all of your public programs. So, your city governments, your parks, all of that. You need to have equal access and equal opportunity to benefit. And then there's also a strong research basis. Decades of research show students with disabilities are not thriving in segregated classrooms. And we'll go into that. That's one of the reasons, hopefully, why you're here today. And I think there's a lot of different reasons that could be. Maybe they feel isolated within the school. They may not have access to core curriculum or certain subjects. They may be denied opportunities because of low expectations, or maybe they don't feel a sense of belonging. Um, it could be a lot of different things, but we do know that they tend not to do as well when they're in separate settings and not given as much opportunity to be with other students. And students with and without disabilities do better academically and socially when they learn together, and classrooms designed to be inclusive. And that last part is really important. It's not, again, just throwing everyone together. It's really being intentional about how you are teaching that class, how you are including students, and what sort of supports are available to all students. And then when you design things to be accessible and responsive, everyone benefits. And you don't have to do necessarily universal design for learning to be inclusive. But a lot of people who are really working in this inclusive space, they really embrace universal design. And that's this concept. It started with architecture, but that's this concept that you design for maximum accessibility. So rather than having, sort of an add-on later to make it accessible, it's just inherently, intrinsically accessible. And they took this was a movement, again, I think probably in the 90s, for around architecture. It really started taking hold. And that's when universal design for learning also really, you had people really looking at that and taking hold of it too. And it's more than that. I encourage you to read about it. It's really a very interesting approach to schools. And inclusionary practices are strategies that teachers use to ensure learning is accessible and responsive. And as I mentioned earlier, when I started this out, we have something called the Inclusionary Practices Technical Network that supports inclusion. And that's actually what one of this series, we're part of the Inclusionary Practices Technical Network. And here's initials that not all parents know about yet, called MTSS. It's a multi-tiered system of support, and it's just a framework. It's a framework that identifies what students need. It can help educators organize their efforts, and teachers can use it to identify who needs extra support and what support is needed. Often it might be designed into like tier one, tier two, tier three. Tier one is everyone. This is what we're doing for everyone. Tier two might be more some targeted supports. Tier three, more individual or intensive supports. It's really interesting that this could be used, again, it's just a framework. It could be used in a way that's segregated and actually kind of exasperates it. If you just decide that all kids who are tier three have to be somewhere else, then I think you could apply MTSS in a way that's promotes segregation. Um, but it can also be used in a way that's very inclusive in the sense that if you use that to identify, oh, this is what our students are needing in tier two and tier three, if you use that to inform what you're doing in tier one, that can make your tier one a lot more accessible and responsive. So again, it's just a framework, can be used in different ways. Um, but the people who are doing inclusive practices work in the schools are finding it very helpful for inclusive education. And here I just explain a little bit more about it, tier one, tier three. And then finally, inclusion, it doesn't just happen, it's a choice. And I think this is also important for all of us to understand. And I think this also reflects some of the comments when I asked about like where in the spectrum of behavioral change are you, that it kind of depends on the person, the place, the year, the day, the minute. Um, because there's a lot on the individual level. Somebody really has to embrace that, yes, I am going to be open to this. I might need to change. I might need to reevaluate what I'm doing to be able to implement a really truly inclusive learning environment. And again, that concept of presumed competence, that is really, really important. And so the inclusionary practices program, it's been underway. It started out as, I believe, was called the Inclusionary Practices Project, possibly pilot. I'm not sure which one it started with. That was for a few years. It set up some demonstration sites and some pilot schools, which are basically kind of like teaching and learning experiences. People can go and they can visit these schools and can learn about what they're doing. And the UW School of Herring, I believe, still oversees that aspect of it. And now they've moved into the technical assistance and so sort of ongoing support, working with school districts specifically so they can become more inclusive. Um, and then this effort, the IPTN this year is targeting two groups specifically. And one is Black African American students with disabilities in general education. And the other one is intellectual and developmental, so students with IDD in general education. And I'll go into why, but it's because they're not in general education as much as other students. This slide is really just, we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. This talks about inclusion. You might have seen this slide or something very similar, but it gets to this concept of, what is exclusion? And that's where you're just complete, you're not even allowed in the space. You're shut out. And then you have segregation where maybe you're getting the same service, but you're getting it in a self-contained setting, a separate school. You're not part of everyone else. You're over here. And then you have integration, and a lot of people use integration and inclusion interchangeably. With this model of thinking, integration is something like, yeah, maybe you're in the main setting, but you're still kind of segregated within that setting. And that's what we see a lot of in schools and integration. So that's like when students aren't really supported how they need to be, and this is bigger than just disability. This is all students. But that's where you really kind of see kids being pushed to the margins. And you see the same kids turn up. And by same kids, I mean sort of like their profile. You see them like who are the ones who are most likely not finishing school on time. Maybe they drop out, maybe they come back later, but they're kind of pushed to the margin like they don't finish on track with their cohorts. You see this in the discipline data. You see this in isolation and restraint data. You just see this again and again. The students who meet certain profiles, they're integrated, but they're not really supported well in that environment. They're expected to be able to adapt to whatever that environment is. And if they can adapt, then they get pushed to the margins. So inclusion is really being more thoughtful. It's really thinking about what sort of policies need to be in place, what sort of practices need to be in place. Like, how do we make this a situation that is supportive of everyone? And it's really about transforming. And that's another reason it makes it so difficult because you really do it does rely on people thinking that, wait a second, maybe the way I'm doing it, maybe it's fine, I can make a small adjustment, but maybe I need to do something different. And that can be really, tough for people. Do they have time? Do they feel they have the capacity? Do they even know how to change? Are they going to be supported in their change? But inclusion really is, at its core, rethinking education in a different way. And so this is why the Inclusionary Practices program right now is targeting Black students and students with IDD. It's because they aren't doing as well. You'll see from this graph shows you uh, what's called least restrict. They call it least restricted one in the state. So that's where kids are in a mainstream setting 80% or more during the day. And so you'll see the ones that kind of have a gray, the ones on the left, that's where they were. And then where it's solid black, it's like that's where they're hoping to see a trajectory. So you can see there's a lot with the students with IDD. They need to have a pretty steep trajectory. You have seen since the beginning, this is since the beginning of the Inclusionary Practices program work. You have seen some slight increases for all students with an IEP. You have seen increases for Black, though much less. Students with an IEP, it's been kind of more flat for students with IDD. So students with IDD are still very much separated out. And this gets into a little bit more of the data. And again, this just relies on LRE, which is not the most ideal. I mean, you could certainly make the argument, I guess they're in the classroom, 80% or more a day, but are they really getting the support? Is it really inclusive and well designed? We don't have a gauge for that right now. What we have is what they're reporting on least restricted environment. And so if they are 80% or more a day, they're probably just a general education student. Maybe they do a little bit of pullout for something very targeted. The sort of light green one is the second tier. And then the gold is the most restricted. And so those are kids who are in self-contained or segregated special education classrooms or schools. Um, and as you can see, the Black students with disabilities are less likely to be in the most inclusive setting. So they're less likely to be in the dark green one. And then, there you go, sorry about that. And then for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, you can see a very big discrepancy. So on the right, that one are all students with disabilities. So everyone who has an IEP. And that's something else you need to know. Whenever you see anything in our state anyways, when it says students with disabilities, they're not talking about IEPs, unfortunately. They really, it's what they use for a student with an IEP, which they didn't, because there's a lot of students with disabilities who have 504 plans, and I wish we had more data about them. But they're not going to be in a segregated setting. They're going to be in a main setting. So, but anyway, students with disability usually is in our state equivalent to a student with an IEP. And an IEP, of course, is an individualized education program. So students with disabilities, we did see when they started the program, we saw that increase. We've been in the bottom 5. Now we're more in I think we're even past the bottom 10. I think now we're in I don't know, maybe 15 to 20. I'm not exactly sure where we are right now, but we've improved. But we really haven't improved much for intellectual and developmental disability. We're still pretty low, and nationwide, we're low too. We're definitely in the bottom 10. And for preschool, we've been in the bottom 5. So this is why they're targeting, is they want to see more kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities in inclusive settings, and they want to see more Black African American students showing some disproportionality. And then this part, I just wanted to leave you with some tools, inclusionary practices. That, if you go there, that's the IPTM website. There's a lot of resources on there. I really encourage you to explore them. End isolation, this is a separate issue from inclusion, but they really seem to be interrelated because we see isolation and restraint really happening with kids who are in these segregated settings. So there's some resources there. That was a program also that OSBI is running. And one of the key things around reducing isolation and restraint, it's a very preventative measure is having a really inclusive, well-supported and responsive classroom for those students. So very interesting. Inclusion also helps with discipline. It helps with identifying the needs of all sorts of learners. It's very positive. And then comprehensive inclusive education, that is a tool. That's a class that we're going to have a webinar on April 22. This is actually a toolkit. It's designed for IEP teams to help them create an IEP that emphasizes inclusion. And then myths and facts, there's a lot of misunderstanding out there. Sometimes it's misunderstandings by parents, sometimes it's misunderstanding by school staff. I certainly can tell you there's a lot of misunderstandings among legislators. A lot of things that people just assume aren't actually true, and that's another really good document. It tells you what the facts are and it cites all the resources. So that is something that's very helpful. So I'm going to take a break right here, and I want to ask first if anyone has any questions and if anyone has any observations. And you can either put in the chat or if you want to speak up, that's fine as well. But any thoughts on the groundwork we just covered? All right. Okay. So now we're going to dive into section 3, the research basis for inclusion. So I'm going to show you a series of photos. So what do these images have in common? Yeah, smiles. They're all smiling. Well, with the exception of that one, because that's a group shot, but I would say they really seem to be genuine smiles as well. Uh, There's a question we'll be sharing this slide deck. Yeah, I'll send out a recording, a link to the recording, and I'll also be sending out a PDF version of the slides. So yeah, so the images all have people smiling in them, all looking relaxed. So earlier we talked about, reflected a little bit about inclusion and exclusion. Now I want you to think a little bit about belonging. What qualities do you associate with belonging? What images come to mind? And what about absence of belonging? What about alienation? And if you could just think for a couple minutes and put some responses in the chat, that would be really great. We have feeling welcome. Support. What about alienation? On the belonging, there was a sense of being left. Yeah. For alienation, someone wrote in loneliness. Yeah. Being different, unable to relate, or maybe feeling people can't relate to you, being cut off. Yeah. So here's a wheel. This comes from work done at the TIES Center. I can't remember right now what TIES stands for, but if you're not familiar with them, it's a great center. And they do a lot of work, not just with inclusion, but specifically inclusion of children with very complex learning needs. So I personally find their work really, really helpful. They really zero in on the kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so they have this inclusion wheel. I'm sorry, actually, excuse me, it's a belonging wheel. They have the belonging wheel. And they broke belonging into all these different qualities. And in the research, they have found that when each of these areas is addressed well, schools become learning environments in which students with disabilities thrive. They're seen as valued and indispensable. They're part of the community. The community demonstrates that and they feel that. They feel belonging. And there's a link so you can explore this wheel and their other. They have a whole, it's kind of organized into online books with chapters. And so there's a lot of resources and reading that you can do. But thinking about belonging, and then also just thinking about what we know about brain development. So we know that experiences shape the brain. It's responsive and dynamic, and it grows and adapts, as you experience life and as you grow and adapt. And it's super busy making connections, really busy when you're young. It starts pruning back at different times and it has growth, but it's constantly responding to what's going on around it, and it never stops being responsive and dynamic. So thinking that this brain is very responsive to what's happening, what can happen then when children experience belonging versus maybe children not experiencing belonging? And so this is something else we know. This is all embedded in work that happens at places like the Harvard Center on the Child, a lot of work around adverse childhood experiences. This is all that body of work. So we know through this experience is good and bad. So your brain's it's gonna respond to really good. It's gonna respond to really bad. Again, it's kind of like that the MTSS framework. It can be good, it can be bad. It's just is. Um, but we know it can be good or bad. And we know that in this framework, and this really comes from the adverse childhood experiences, we know that stress affects the brain. Stress in and of itself is not a bad thing. I mean, stress can be fine. It teaches you, becoming more resilient. Stress can be okay. It's when you get a lot of stress, when you get too much stress, when you get toxic stress, that can start affecting your health and well-being. So we know this. But we also know from this research that, okay, so like the bad experiences affect you. Well, guess what? The good experiences also affects you in a very positive way. And they also found that not only is it very positive, just like if good, you're going to do better, but it actually helps buffer and mitigate bad experiences. So we know that, the positive, we know relationship building, we know people have certain skills around social emotional development. We know that they can do very well, and that even when they have a lot of stress in their life, that they manage it a little bit better. And we know also things that help from others helps reduce stress. So this would include like more the community. So if you've got a really strong family community, maybe neighborhood community, maybe you have a cultural connection, religious connections, if you've got this sense of relationship about you, a strong school connection, that can be very helpful. Also, things like very, like, life things like, housing instability. If you've got supports that you're not housing unstable, if you have supports so you're not food unstable, that can also be very helpful. Also, support that people are actively thinking about, like, wait a second, how are people affected by racism and ableism and other bias? How are we mitigating those? All of that we know can be very good. And if there's bad stuff going on, it can help mitigate that. So now just wanted to have you think about that in the context of belonging. So again, belonging is a very positive thing. Um, Not having belonging is a very negative thing. And so how might that affect the brain? And again, this is sort of the underlying principles of, why inclusion. Um, there's a lot of studies about how kids are doing in the classroom, but even more fundamental than that, I would argue, is that it's good for the brain. At a very fundamental level, your brain is going to respond to loneliness. It's going to respond to being alienated. It's going to respond to being different or unable to relate or feeling that people aren't relating to you. It's going to respond to being cut off. It's also going to respond to being present, to being needed. I mean, not just like you're there and I'll help you out, but like I need you, to being heard, accepted, known. So the sense of belonging is really foundational. I mean, it's foundational to learning, but it's just foundational to life. And it's foundational to health and well-being. And within this is what I think is the challenge is not everybody gets to belong. They should belong. Legally, they should belong. Morally, they should belong. You can make all kinds of arguments about, should. Um, but the reality is, a lot of people don't really have to think about belonging. They sort of are the majority. They feel like they fit in. Their basic needs are already taken care of. They're not from another culture. They don't speak a different language. They don't look or act particularly differently. Their sensories are similar. They don't hear differently or talk differently or, communicate differently. And for them, belonging might just be, the norm. That's the norm. But unfortunately, for some people, belonging is not the norm. And for a lot of people with disabilities, especially significant disabilities, it's not the norm. And that's where we have to be really intentional about that. And then also on this slide, just putting in the fact that disability, it's natural. It's a part of us. It's not like disability is new. Disability has been around since, people have been around. Um, the concept of not, we didn't always have kids allowed to go to public school who had disabilities. This is true, but they've had the legal right since the 1970s. So it's not a new thing to have kids with disabilities. But yet they often aren't feeling belonged and they often aren't being included. And there's a comment. It's really hard to reverse negative feedback loops and redirect negative neural pathways. Yeah. So we know that inclusion is important from the start. We know that children seek to belong and learn and connect socially very early in life. And we know that early inclusion promotes continued social connection and community. Early isolation predicts longer term isolation. So these are things we are aware of. I'm going to pause there. If anyone has any questions or any comments, any reflections? So now I'm going to go a little bit more into the research in terms of what they've learned at the school level. And a lot of this research it's replicated in various places. A lot of it is also captured in the OSBI's myths and facts series that they have. But we've been studying inclusion. It might have been called mainstreaming or integration, but this concept of supporting kids to be able to thrive together. who have different profiles, different needs, different learning needs, for decades, a long time. Again, this is not a new thing. And they found, first of all, yes, it can be done. The individualized, evidence-based strategies, they can happen in the general education classroom. You do not have to pull someone out separately. It can be successfully supported in the classroom along with everyone else. We also know that it works, that they do it successfully. Students can make significant progress. We also know that their peers make progress as well. I put a source on here, the U.S. Department. This was a policy paper. It was first issued in 2015. I believe it was reissued again last year. They will have all the specific citations for the different studies. And so I encourage you to have a look at that. We also know in the scientific base that kids learn from each other. So that's something that's important too. That a lot of what they're learning is related to what their peers are learning. And that they learn together with support. And they also found out, and this plays a little bit more with at preschool. You'll see in some preschool programs, you have the full inclusion model where you're all learning together, and maybe some students they get their services might be pushed into the classroom, or maybe they get pulled out for separate services, but they're all basically part of the same preschool class. That would be an inclusive setting. But then we also started seeing things where they would have that, but maybe it would be like, maybe there were 10 kids in the class and 8 of them had disabilities and 2 did not. And they would call this a peer model. And so they studied, it's like, is that inclusive? Does that matter? And they found out that, yeah, it actually does, and not in a good way. Students do, it doesn't hurt them, but students do better with at least 50-50. So you want, and in a K-12 classroom, that's usually the norm because we all go to school. But in preschool, not a lot of schools don't have public preschool for all children. They only have special education services preschool. So you were seeing, and we still do see a lot in our state, a lot of just preschool programs that are only for students with disabilities. And they found that actually, yeah, if they can switch those up and make sure that they are an inclusive model with at least 50% students with and without disabilities, that actually is a much better learning environment for the students. And then we also know that inclusion benefits everyone. Um, Positive, social, emotional. The special education staff at OSBI that are working with the inclusionary practices, they also found that it was really supporting all kids academically, and it kind of got back to because they were using the MTS version in this, and so they weren't just sort of looking for kids then who were having problems and then sort of thinking, well, do you qualify for special education? It's as a habit of practice. They're evaluating all children and seeing what sort of supports do all children need, and not just students with disabilities, but even students without disabilities. Do they need some targeted intervention? What's going on there? And this MTS process, they found 2 things: that then everyone was doing better because everyone's getting a little bit more attention. They're designing that they were using this then to inform how they can improve the general, that tier 1 education for everyone. So that helped everyone. It also helps curb over identification for special education services because maybe they even have a disability, but not everyone who has a disability necessarily requires an individualized education program. And so getting supports just naturally throughout the day, they didn't necessarily have to be identified for special education services before they got support. So they found that it's really academically beneficial as well when it's used in a inclusive way with the MTSS model. And then the qualities of the district. So you want key personnel in positions of authority because a lot of your budgeting, a lot of your resource delegation, it really happens at the district level. It doesn't necessarily happen at the school level or the classroom level. It's not to say that your individual classrooms and your individual schools can't really adopt a sense of a belonging, a framework. They can't include inclusionary practices in their classroom. You certainly can. But where they really found this took hold, there was a leadership component. And so it is important that your school board be on target. It was important for administrators to be on target, and there's a shared vision by the key players. Your state policy, your national policies are also really important. In our state, we do have this IPTN thing going on. We do have, the state OSBI, so the state, excuse me, I'm sorry, the state administrators for the public schools, like at least within the special education system, they're on board. I can't speak for everyone in OSBI, but it's certainly a sea change away from where they were even 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we would ask about inclusion and it just felt like you were talking to the wall. And now you feel like you have partners. Um, but we do not have it as a state, like, say, a legislative policy. It's not in our policy at all right now to promote inclusion. It's something where, literally most every year we have to ask, will you please continue to fund inclusionary practices? Will you fund this particular project if there's this specific thing? So we're kind of challenged there. We also know that your training and your external support is really critical. And that's where the state right now has been focusing. OSBI has been focusing on that training and external support. It's one of the reasons why they started with, let's set up some demonstration sites, let's set up some pilot sites, and then let's set up a system where we can do some targeted support with school districts who want to work on inclusion. And of course, your organizational structure is also going to be critical. And it's all kinds of things. So it's your school board policies, it's your school budgets, your district budgets, but it's also things like your collective bargaining agreements. They really need to be aligned. And so this is where we found more inclusion can take root and it can thrive and it can be sustained. These are the qualities that they found in the research. One thing is the myth of expense. And again, there's also something, excuse me, I see in the legislature. They assume that, well, inclusive education is more expensive. And I will say, I think inclusion, and I think a lot of people would agree with me. I don't think I'm going on a limb here. To really be good, I think, to make this accessible and responsive, your ratios are going to be really important. You want to make sure you've got staff to carry this out. You don't have one under-resourced professional in there, that you've got a team of resource professionals working. So in that sense, that would be a quality education. So if you look at what is a quality general education, then, I don't think inclusion in and of itself is necessarily more expensive. Um, but when they were just looking at it, I said, okay, the schools that were doing an inclusion model, like say some of our demonstration sites in the state versus your sort of dual track self-contained placements, it was not more expensive for the schools doing the inclusive. And in fact, that when they set up the demonstration sites in our state for the Inclusionary Practices Project, they weren't getting different money. They had to use it and be really thoughtful about how they're using resources. And they probably would have really liked some extra money, and maybe they could have done it easier and better and sooner with extra money. But the reality is they had to make it work within existing resources. And I don't say that to say we should starve our schools and we shouldn't give them the funding that they need. I'm just saying that because a lot of people will say, oh, we don't have the money to do that. That is a really expensive thing. And the research doesn't back it up. And then we also know that inclusion for young children with disabilities, many, many, many years of research. And so these are some of the highlights. Again, none of this is new. Inclusion, it's more than a physical placement. We want to make sure that it has that sense of belonging. Children are part of this larger movement, sense of membership. They looked at, what does quality mean? Quality means access, participation, and supports. So, and I really want to emphasize that, not just supports, it's the access and the participation. Again, it's that sense of belonging, membership. And then access, they looked at that and they found that it meant the removal of barriers and the addition of different ways to promote learning. And that kind of also gets into your universal design for learning. So universal design for learning is, you want to make sure it's really designed to be accessible and responsive. You're proactively thinking, how can I make sure that, this is kids are getting this? Like maybe you have books that are on tape, but books where I was reading. You think as much as you can ahead of time. Some people describe it as laying out a buffet. So rather than, cooking a meal for you and a meal for you and a meal for you, what you're doing is you're laying out the taco bar and then people grab what they can get. And what's also interesting, the universal design is it also emphasizes that, people will they take in information differently and people, share information differently. So it takes that into account. And it really gives kids a lot of autonomy in the how and the what and the where and the why of learning. And they seem to thrive really well with that model. And again, it's not just students with disabilities, it's all students. There's that autonomy that's built in. Participation, they've known that, again, now we're seeing that it really does help academics, but there's years of research that really shows the social emotional aspects of it. Gotta let somebody in. And then also the supports, infrastructure that supports inclusive services. And again, that's where I think some of your front end expenses, because you got to shift things around. You do need, it's not like you can do this without any money whatsoever, but it doesn't necessarily require more funding than having two systems of education would require. Gonna pause again if anyone has any questions or comments. No? Okay. All right. So this one, the myth of clinical judgment. So a lot of times there's this assumption that, well, if they need something different, um, of course it's special to let them go. It's not special. It's going to be very important for them to be in a separate setting for that so they can really focus on that. And there was always this assumption that there's a lot of, professional judgment going into this. There's really consideration. Should it be this kind of setting or that kind of setting? But the research, and this goes back to the 80s, showed that it actually wasn't so much like, what the child's individual needs are. It really had a lot more to do with how the district organized things. Like, what was their tendency to do things? Did they have a program set up and so they would just sort of like track them onto a certain program? Just opinion, like where people felt students should be and the opportunities they should get. So they found that there really was this disconnection and that it wasn't really honestly a well thought out decision to send someone separately. It was just sort of the way the school operated. And then the educational placement of students with disabilities. So I've got there's two different things on this slide. Bicklin was the one about the myth of clinical judgment. And then the other one was the educational placement of students with autism and the impact of state of residence. So they were kind of looking at that, like how does it affect? And again, they found similar things. They said that first they found the funding didn't necessarily, that wasn't the big driver. Again, I'm not saying funding doesn't matter. I mean, obviously funding matters. But that wasn't the big driver. It's like more funding, less funding didn't necessarily drive them one way or another. It wasn't even necessarily individual child characteristics. It had to do things with how they did things. Like when they did this study, they found that for whatever reason, a lot of the kids, a lot of autistic kids in the Eastern United States were in special programs for kids with autism, whereas in the Western United States that they were studying, they didn't necessarily have that. It just seemed to do with a lot more with assumptions that the adults around were making and not so much about the individual needs of the student in general. And then this is called the gap that matters. I personally think this one is really important. So a lot of times, so you say you have two third graders, and one has a learning disability and one does not have a learning disability. And like third grade, that's really when you kind of really see the kids, especially with readers. So the kids who are confident readers are good. You just start to see them go, 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 go. And then the kids who don't have those basic skills yet, you just see them not just stall, but they kind of sink, because they're not getting the new material that's being presented to them. They know they're not getting the new material that's presented to them. You start to see a lot of, you know, behavior, a lot of just a lot of struggle that comes with that when you know that you're not where your peers are. And so there's a lot of like, okay, well, we know that, this person is not where this person is. And so we need to make sure that we're wrapping them in support, and we'll go this over here. And they kind of look at that gap as that's the reason why the one here has to go over here and get the special support, because they're looking at the gap between the student with a disability, often a learning disability, and someone who does not have a learning disability. This study says that's the wrong thing to look at. They have a learning disability. Yes, they have a learning disability, so you might see some gap there. What you should be doing is you should be looking at the students with the learning disabilities. How are they doing inclusive placement versus a segregated placement? Like, how are they doing? Well, how does the placement affect them? Not the gap with the students without disabilities, but how does it affect their learning, depending on whether they're in a segregated setting or they're in an inclusive setting. And this was math, which a lot of people in our tech-centric state care a lot about math and science. And this is what this study found, is that the kids did a lot better who were in inclusive placement. Yeah, they may not have been where the peers without disabilities were, but compared to the kids who were in self-contained settings, they were doing a lot better. So here you have the numbers for fifth graders with disabilities. So before inclusive reform, they were at 18% scoring. Um, and then 2 years after, they're at 43. But look also at this. Everyone else did better too. So all fifth graders did better, not just the fifth graders with disabilities. They all did better. Same thing with sixth grade. It's like this one was pretty profound. It's like the sixth graders with disabilities in the segregated settings, 18% at or above grade level. And then 2 years after reform, I think we're looking at sixth graders, 53%. And here, again, all of them made a boost too. So this study is really saying this is one of the studies you look at when you say that inclusion benefits all students. It definitely benefited the students with disabilities. It benefited all the students. Did it close the gap entirely between students with disabilities and without disabilities? No, but is that actually the gap that we even want to be tracking? And this study, they premise that no, that's actually not the important gap. The important gap is what's the effect of inclusion, not and are they progressing and at what rate are they progressing? Not necessarily are they equal in progression with students without disabilities. And then we have getting back again to that presuming competence. And this gets to ableism, and this gets to bias, and this just gets to our attitudes about disability. Um, with segregation, you really come to a perceived ability often. There's an expectation. They can get cut off from social connections. They can have very narrow learning opportunities. We do know the research shows that a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times they don't have the same access to the same types of education. Like they don't necessarily have access to civics. They may not have access to a healthy relationships, type of curriculum. They can have very limited access, and that could be intentionally, or it could just be that the curriculum for civics was never really adapted in a way to make it accessible to those students. But we do know that students who are in self-contained settings often do not have the same access to curriculum that students in a mainstream setting do. They often don't have access to subject expertise at the level that mainstream settings do. And so they're cut off from learning opportunities, and they also their pool of people who they're connecting with and who their peers and who they're spending their days with is also much smaller. It's if it's the same kids in the same classroom, they're not making the same relationships and connections. Are they welcomed in some of the other clubs so they can pursue their own interests outside of academics, things like that? And we know that with inclusion, they get a lot more varied learning opportunities and they get space to develop. And we see that's very, very beneficial. And so here we've got a couple resources for you. The one on the left just really looks at like just the highlights of what some of the benefits are. The one at the right is, it's nice, big, thick policy PDF. I don't know how many pages, but many pages. It's going to have all those different studies we were just talking about, so you can link to it. It's good. It's a good thing. One thing we didn't talk about much in this class. Um, but something I find very interesting when the inclusion benefits everyone, we're talking about, I was sharing earlier about the students with and without disabilities, um, but also the society aspects. Because, and I think this plays directly in our state, especially. Um, I don't have the stats in this particular class, but tracking the IDEA every year, states have to report their least restricted environment and other types of data. They have to report that to Congress, and then they put together this big report, and it basically breaks down everything like what's your LRE data, what's your disproportionality data, like what sort of setting are the kids in, has all this information. And when you look at that, that's where you can see how much of an outlier Washington is. Um, Again, we've actually improved quite a bit. We're still struggling with the Black African American students, hence, this particular focus this year. We're really struggling. We really haven't, cracked it with kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which are usually a little more complex needs kids. We haven't cracked it with that, but we have made some progress. But we're still kind of an outlier. And before this whole thing started, like we were like for intellectual disability and separate settings, we were like number two in the nation for most segregated. And it affects our culture, it affects our society, it affects the expectations. We'll see this, those of us who are in this advocacy world and we're working with adults as well. People just have these expectations with adults that, they're not part of our community, and we see this in our legislative decisions and our policy decisions, our state budgeting decisions. It's like, do you think kids with disabilities, if they're kind of like they belong somewhere else, do you think the same for adults, that they belong somewhere else? If you don't really believe they're competent enough to, have some autonomy and learn, and be really participant in their school, what does that say when they're adult? And if you have generations of this, is there anybody who's out there ready to say, that's not a rational attitude to have? And so I think we really see this in our society as well. So there's some really societal benefits as well to inclusion. I'm not going to show the video because I never get really good quality, but hopefully you know about showing more. If not, I encourage you to watch this on your own later or Google her. She's got all kinds of these quick little 5-minute videos. She also did several classes as part last year. She and Katie Novak did a whole series that was part of the Inclusionary Practices Technical Network. She's actually based in Vancouver, Canada, but she just brings a sense of humor, a warm approach to it, and it's very small, digestible. It's really good for people who are like, what are you talking about? Why do you want that? She breaks it down really nicely. She's someone who's an educator, and she's also someone who identifies as having disabilities. And then um, this one is Access for Inclusion, and this is going to be just a little group quiz. And this is really intended just to help you think through and process and maybe apply what we've just been talking about for the last 60, 70 minutes. So I'm going to give you some scenarios, and you can just go ahead and put in the chat if you want, or speak up if you want. So is this access or is this inclusion? An autistic child is placed in a regular education classroom that offers a sensory area just for his use. So is that access or is that inclusion? Access. Yeah, because it's just for him. It's nice. I mean, they're making it accessible to him, but it's just for him. A child works with the paraeducator in the back of the room. Is that access or that inclusion? We have access again. Okay. Number three, we have a local theater troupe offers one play a week with American Sign Language interpretation, low lighting, no flashing lights, and lower volume level. These showings are specifically marketed through disability organizations. So do we think this one's access or is this one inclusion? Yeah, question mark. I agree. I think if he had left off the marketing, it seems pretty inclusive. But then it kind of feels like, well, they made this inclusive setting. Is it just because they market it? Does that make it not inclusive? I actually think it's inclusive. But maybe if their marketing said for everyone, I don't know. I don't know. So for four, we have a town parade advertisements in plain language state that accommodations will be provided for anyone requesting them. There will be a noise level limit. The route and the bathrooms along it will be accessible, and that there will be a person making sure that needed accommodations are made. Yes, that's inclusion. They thought about it, they planned for accessibility, they realized that they probably haven't planned for every scenario, so they need to be prepared to be adapt. They want to be responsive. That's inclusive. And then five, a 4-year-old disabled child who uses diapers is warmly welcomed in the neighborhood childcare and placed in the 1 to 3-year-old age group so that her toileting needs can be efficiently met. Access or inclusion. Yeah, that one is access. So this is a tool. This was, I mentioned them earlier, the TIE Center. The wheel that we looked at earlier, what they did is they made it very simple. This is a reflection tool. It's just a Word document. This is low tech to the max. They took all their different principles. There were different parts of the wheel. They put them on one side, and then they just asked two reflective questions. Are we doing this really well? What can we be doing better or differently? And then they have next steps. And it can be used individually. It's really intended to be a collective. So, like a school team could do this together, a PTA could work with the school to do it together. But it's really, really trying to be thoughtful about what is our school? Like, how do we promote belonging? Like, even, not even getting into the inclusive IEP ins and out, all that, just like backing up and saying, wait, are we actually promoting belonging, which is not the same thing as being welcoming. Welcoming is part of that. A lot of schools say, yes, I'm welcoming, but are all the kids really feeling that they belong to that community? So the actual reflection toolkit is a link on the corner. And then that whole sort of chapter they have about belonging and the research and all the commentary have a link to that as well. It's a really good resource. And then this is the class that's coming up. And I've actually got a few more people who want to be sponsors too. So I got to squeeze in more logos and update that. But this is the class on crafting and implementing an inclusive IEP. This was created with OSBI, so our state school administrators, along with the TIE Center. And it's really intended to be a tool to support IEP teams for comprehensive inclusive education. I'm really excited about it because it specifically targets kids with complex needs. So the kids where people say, oh yeah, we can do inclusion, but not for those kids. Those kids have to have individualized education, and that means they have to go somewhere else. This is the kind of tool that says, no, that's not what we want to think about. So this is going to be a class. They presented this tool and had some workshops on it last fall or winter. I think the tool came out in November, and I think they had classes in January. But they want to, it's the same tool, but they want to look at it and they want to design something to introduce it to families. and it's going to be really focused on families. So school people are welcome to come, educators are welcome to come, but this is really about introducing the tool to families for their sensibilities. And I also want to emphasize it's not like a 101 on the special education process or the whole IEP process. It's really going to just be unpacking this particular tool. Um, so you can sign up for this. Some of you people here belong to organizations that are co-sponsors, so yay, thank you. Um, you can sign on. There's the one bit.ly up there, and then you can also, if you want, you can access this tool. It's on OSPI's website, so you can look at it ahead of time and share it out already right now. And then I am going to add this to the chat. This is, of course, the class survey that we always ask everyone to take. Let me see, did I get it in there? There we go. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording right now. And then if anyone wants to chat or has questions, has observations, we can make them without the recording going on.